after our candidate forum on Wednesday night, I was a little nervous to preach at this service because Ben and Kathy Durfee sat with the college students who attend King Avenue worship services and small groups. I'm realizing, however, that though I am a millennial along with them, that I do differ in age from them. So I'm going to compare and contrast myself with the college students right now. So first, a comparison. And this is completely appropriate on Stewardship Sunday. I will be taking a selfie with all of you. Ready? Everybody wave. 1, 2, 3. Hooray. Okay, yep. We'll make sure we get both wings over here. Ready? One over here. Wave hello. And one for this side over here. Blenders too. Everybody wave hi. Okay. Rhonda, I'll email those to you. Okay. Now for the contrasting. I am continually learning phrases, words, colloquialisms that folks who are under 22 have been using. And I ran across one a few weeks ago that I'd like to share with you. And this word is meta. Has anybody heard meta? Especially, you have to have heard it used in context by somebody who is probably under 23. No, there's...
I met a nice person.
Good try, but not quite. So I'm going to use it in a sentence. Maybe it'll clear it up, or maybe it won't. Colleen and I had a meta conversation in the car on the way home from the YWCA luncheon this week. No? Not helpful? Intense, sort of. If you Google it, you get a definition about many layers, really deep, sort of metaphysical, if you will. But a student will say, like, oh, that artwork, that's meta. So, during last year's study, the students and I had a conversation that turned out to be quite meta. And it was about the reframing of time. Now, usually in the way we understand time, we start at the very beginning, especially if you're Julie Anders. You start at the very beginning. Oh, yeah, but preacher humor. So you start at the beginning and you travel along the timeline, and eventually on that timeline you get a little blip that's the present, but you keep moving into the future. But it seems that the beginning is the most important part. But in our discussion, we talked about how things might look differently if the most foundational piece of time wasn't the beginning, but was instead the present. Now, this is still limiting time to a linear model, but imagine that the present is the most important, and that the future and the past both extend out from the present, instead of just the present and the future coming after, see, meta, yeah. Maybe you had to be there. But last week, Pastor John talked about King Avenue's present. So this week, I would like us to turn our gaze to King Avenue's past, but what that past means for us today. Now, I know I've mentioned the New Testament scholar who is a Jewish woman named Amy Jill Levine. I've talked about her before, but she focuses in her work on helping Christians not slide, whether accidentally or purposefully, into anti-Semitism. When we heard today's text, however, it seems a bit as though the opposite is happening. Instead of the Christian experience overshadowing and oppressing the Jewish, this portion of Acts is the Jewish Christ followers engaging in a bit of discrimination of their own. Now, let me be clear that this is not Jews oppressing Christians. This story is about the tension between Jewish Christ followers and the others, the God-fearers that Pastor John talked about last week. Within the early Christian movement, tensions were really high as to who was in and who was out. So today's lesson is a retelling of past events. Peter has had this vision of the sheet with the animals, and Peter went to and ate with the uncircumcised believers, Cornelius and his household, and then they believed even more. The problem is that the story of the events beat Peter back to Jerusalem. So what we heard read by Jeannie may have even been seen more as a defense of himself than it is a retelling of the past events. When Peter received instructions from God in his vision to eat impure and unclean foods, Peter's first and appropriate response was, "Surely not. I have never and will never eat anything impure or unclean." Peter was a faithful Jewish Christ follower whose adherence to the law as it had been interpreted separated him from others who were seeking to follow Jesus. Now, there was no physical dividing line between Peter and the Gentile Christ followers, but the line was felt in a major way. Even though dividing lines are not always physical barriers able to be seen, that doesn't make them less real. The first time I learned this lesson, I learned it from a dog. My aunt and uncle live on the outskirts of Kalamazoo, Michigan, on a beautiful wooded property. And in my childhood, they had adopted Gabby, a small shepherd type of dog with lots of energy. And as Gabby grew, they realized that she needed space off leash to run. But they didn't know how to allow her this freedom while keeping her safe. They learned quickly, though, about a technology which 20 years ago was cutting edge. They got an invisible fence. My Uncle Mike buried the line around the property and trained Gabby in what would happen if she would cross that line. Straying over the line would result in an unpleasant, albeit small, shock from the collar that she now wore at all times. The fence was not so much about keeping other things out. It was meant for keeping Gabby in. Keeping her in within comfortable boundaries, keeping her safe and secure. But the more I've thought about fences, whether physical or invisible, the more I've realized that that's usually the purpose of a fence, is not to keep things out, but to keep something or someone in. So the boundaries that Peter had experienced up until now, the boundaries that he and others adhered to, kept them on the inside. It left them feeling safe and secure. For them, dietary restrictions not only designated which foods you did or did not eat, but consequently it dictated whose presence you ate those foods in. And as we know all too well, when a rule either explicitly or implicitly implies that one group must remain separate from another, our natural human tendency is then to rank those groups above and against each other. The necessity of Peter's defense of his own actions shows that the circumcised believers in Jerusalem who heard of Peter's dirty dining were upset because they thought that their status at the top, their status as insiders, was being compromised by the actions that Peter had taken. We are so good at justifying and scapegoating others. So just as the purity laws that the Jewish Christ followers adhered to lent themselves to spiritual stratification against those God-fearers who were unclean, we are at a lot of times good at making ourselves more holy by setting ourselves against those who are less holy. And though we do see that in religious circles, we also encounter it in our everyday lives. How many of you have met the notorious one-upper? You know, that guy who can only feel good about his job because he got the promotion that you didn't. Or that woman that is prettier than you, and that's the only way she feels pretty at all. The emotions of this story are not unfamiliar to us in our culture at King Avenue. And though we live in a wonderful present where all are welcome, many of you were here when the journey towards the inclusion of individuals identifying as GLBTQ brought up many concerns similar to those of the circumcised believers in today's scripture lesson. Just like those first Christ-following Jews, many in our own community, on the inside, wondered how we would live into community after having included those whose lives looked different or those who had been relegated to the outside status. But just like Peter heard the Spirit in verse 12, King Avenue heard the Spirit in its past saying, "Make no distinctions." King Avenue's past led us to the place that we are now, a place where, regardless of what outside culture and even the institutional church might say, no distinctions are made. We reflect the message of Acts, but we know that our culture, and yes, again, even our institutional church, find themselves stuck in that distinction of who's in and who's out, who's right and who's wrong. But again, it's not just the church. We are really good at making distinctions. Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal, Fox or MSN, biblical literalist or whatever the opposite of biblical literalist is, and we're still trying to figure that out. Peter's experience of being called forward from his past to make no distinctions continues to be a tall order for us, not only in our church, but also in our culture. Peter brought about a shift in the mission of the church, a mission which up until that point had been internal. But Peter took that mission and spread it to the Gentiles, and we heard that the Spirit was present there. In the first hearing of the story, those who were on the inside were upset. They demanded Peter explain himself. But after Peter has recounted the whole experience, those who were on the inside were silenced, and they praised God. Even those who at first clung to the narrow mission were transformed by Peter's experience of inclusion, and they praised God. There is such simplicity in that statement, and they praised God. So I don't want us to negate the incredible power of them being transformed by the hearing and moved to worship, but I can't help but think of what that sentence does not say. In fact, I've been moved by what the whole narrative doesn't say. This narrative does not say anything about Peter walking in and demanding the circumcised believers change their ways. He doesn't say to them, well, I ate with the Gentiles, now you have to as well. Peter doesn't challenge their adherence to the law. Peter honored their collective past, but the Spirit drew him forward to widen the message, and the Spirit changed the hearts of those who heard. Peter simply shares his experience, and those on the inside recognize the work of the Spirit. It's almost as though they turned off that invisible fence. And after this story, the message of Jesus Christ is accessible to people that had been cut off from it previously. So today we honor our collective past. And in a way, we'll eat together just like Peter and the household of Cornelius did. We'll dine around Christ's table at which all are welcome and no distinctions are made. But most importantly, we will recognize the Spirit's work within us and our community that is widening the message. But with the widening of the message comes necessity. The need for more time, more energy, more giving. So I was thinking about asking your permission to be a little blunt, but then I decided I've got the microphone, so I'm just going to do it anyway. In my experience, the reason that many congregations bristle around stewardship season is because the reason they're being encouraged to give is to save a sinking ship. They're being encouraged to give of their resources so that those on the inside can continue to feel safe and secure on the inside. Their giving is to lay the invisible fence line just a bit further and keep the batteries of the collar charged up. But as we've looked at stewardship at King Avenue, we have recognized that that little collar can't keep the message of the gospel on the inside anymore. The gospel is meant to go out, and in its going out, it gets bigger. Our giving affirms our past, knowing that our past has value, but it also recognizes that the Spirit is moving us into the future. We are engaging in more mission than we ever have here at King Avenue. We're hosting more support groups and community organizations than we ever have. It is rare to walk into this building and find it empty. We're forming partnerships in the community in new places so that God's message of love and care and inclusion can go out to new people in new places. And all of those things require resourcing. So next year, our budget will grow. It will be bigger. But instead of panic over how we're going to fund everything, I hope that we'll see it as the Spirit moving us forward from our past into an exciting future. Because like the college students and I learned, the present is the pivotal moment. So today we honor our past, and we are proud of the Spirit's movement in and through King Avenue. But we know that there are places that the message of Christ has not yet reached. And through our time, our energy, and our giving, may we support the Spirit's movement in this place. Amen.